When we talk about supporters in nonprofits, usually we are referring to people who donate and/or volunteer. But there's another critically important form of support that individuals can provide to nonprofit agencies, which is advocacy. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how nonprofit leaders can mobilize advocates and engage in advocacy actions that further their mission through public opinion and legislative action. Now let's move on to the important stakeholder group of the community. This is the entire reason that nonprofits exist, is to serve their constituents and to serve their communities. In this lesson, we're going to talk about advocacy and the role advocacy plays in nonprofit work and in serving those communities. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand all about nonprofit advocacy and its primary categories. You'll know the differences between different types of advocacy initiatives, what lobbying means, and how grassroots lobbying plays a role in nonprofit advocacy work. You'll also understand the need for policy research as a tool for nonprofit advocacy. You'll be able to differentiate between political campaign activity and lobbying, and you'll understand the nonprofit limitations and restrictions when it comes to advocacy. And finally, you'll be able to understand strategies of how nonprofits go about mobilizing their advocates. First, let's talk about nonprofit advocacy, what this means, what it is, and what the two primary advocacy categories are. Nonprofit advocacy refers to the efforts that we undertake to influence people, public policies, laws, regulations, and even public opinion. And it's about influencing opinions and people in support of our mission. Now, sometimes you'll hear the term lobbying. That is different than advocacy, and it's important to understand these distinctions. Advocacy encompasses efforts not just about influencing policy, but it's also about building awareness and educating the public. Nonprofit advocacy activities can be categorized in one of two buckets. One is public awareness campaigns, and the other is lobbying. With public awareness campaigns, we're trying to educate and build public awareness. We do this through public education campaigns, but also through media and communication advocacy. And sometimes we even do it through civil disobedience. Lobbying, on the other hand, is more directly trying to influence legislation. This is activities including direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying, and political campaign activity. And as we'll discuss, that last one, political campaign activity, is very limited in terms of what nonprofits are allowed to do. First, let's talk about advocacy. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at all the nonprofits and their leaders, a lot of the leaders of nonprofits, they have some mixed feelings about advocacy. Now, advocacy organizations that exist for the purpose of advocating, they're going to be staunchly on the side of advocacy work. That's literally what they do. That's why they exist. That is their mission. But for direct service nonprofit agencies, they're a little more conflicted when it comes to advocacy. Nonprofit organizations that tend to have a larger workforce, a larger budget, they tend to engage more extensively in advocacy efforts. And as a refresher, going way back to our first lesson, remember that if we look at all the different nonprofits in the world, we can categorize them into one of two buckets. One are advocacy nonprofits. Those are the ones that seek to advocate and influence legislation. And then we have direct service nonprofits. And these are those agencies that primarily exist to provide services, programs, and initiatives in support of the community. Now, many direct service nonprofits advocate. Some advocacy organizations also provide direct services. So if you see a Venn diagram like this, you'll see that there is some overlap. There are some nonprofits that do both. They advocate and they serve. However, some only advocate, and some agencies only provide direct services. And the reason that direct service agency leaders are sometimes reticent to engage in advocacy efforts is because it can be very polarizing. Anytime you're trying to influence legislation or dealing with anything in politics in the United States, people are going to be a little bit divided, and that can influence donor support and other things like that that can negatively impact that agency. When it comes to advocacy, one of the ways that nonprofit agencies advocate is through public awareness campaigns. A public awareness campaign is simply a strategic initiative that is intended to inform, educate, and to raise awareness among stakeholders about the nonprofit and its mission and work. The whole purpose of these campaigns are to inspire action and to mobilize people and resources around an effort together to unify to advance the organizational mission. So we want to make sure our constituents know why we exist as nonprofit agencies, what's important to us, what we're trying to achieve, what our mission is, and to make them aware of this to mobilize everyone together as a unified front. Public education campaigns are a type of public awareness campaign. But with the public education campaign, this is a broader educational objective. So instead of necessarily trying to mobilize our own constituents and stakeholder groups, we're trying to provide a broader audience with detailed information, understanding, and knowledge around a particular issue. So if I run an organization that deals with the unhoused population, I want to do public education campaigns sharing statistics about the number of people in our country that are dealing with housing insecurity or that are unhoused. So it's that overarching broader educational objective, really trying to inform and to educate. Public awareness campaigns, on the other hand, are more about action and mobilizing people. One of the ways we engage in public awareness campaigns, obviously, is through media and communication advocacy. We need to use different media channels to get out our message and to engage with the public. This can include efforts like writing op-eds, which means opinion pieces. So you're writing an opinion piece, you're trying to get it published online in a newsletter, in a newspaper, or any other type of communication channel so people can understand your organization's stance on a particular issue. It can involve public relations, which as a refresher is unpaid marketing. So you're trying to get the news media to pick up on your messaging and to share that with the public. It can also mean doing interviews with journalists or any other activity that gets your message out there to the broader audience. Now, sometimes nonprofits need to take a really firm, hard stance on an issue. And in this case, they may even engage in a type of public awareness campaign that is called civil disobedience. This is where they're making a big splash to draw attention to an issue that is really significant. So these are nonviolent, but they are things that sometimes may even result in arrest, or they may be technically violating the law. This may be going up to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., having your supporters mobilize and sit in outside of a legislator's office, even when you're asked to leave, and say, we're not moving until we get your agreement that our issue is important and that you're going to vote on legislation that advances this mission and this cause. Next, let's talk about lobbying, what lobbying is, and the differences between direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. Lobbying refers to activities that nonprofits do with the effort to influence policies, laws, regulations, and decisions. This really puts nonprofits in the democratic process, in that legislative process. And their purpose here is to advocate for issues that align with their mission. Their goal is to advance their causes, to change public policy in accordance and in alignment with their overarching organizational mission. And the whole purpose is to create a positive impact on the communities that they serve. When we engage in lobbying efforts, we can break this down into two categories. Lobbying can either be direct or it can be grassroots in nature. Now that you know what lobbying is and that there's two types of lobbying, let's talk about some specific strategies around both direct and grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying is, well, obviously, it's direct. With direct lobbying, the nonprofit agencies are directly going to legislators and government officials and lawmakers, and they're trying to advocate for their cause and their mission, and they're trying to influence public policy. So they're directly communicating, they're holding meetings, they're emailing, they're sending letters, they're making phone calls. They're doing all of the things to get face time with these legislators to get them to support legislation that advances their mission. Now, this is really important because in the United States, there are some restrictions that nonprofit agencies have when it comes to influence and interference with the legislative process. So nonprofits are allowed to engage in direct lobbying, but there are some legal restrictions that they have to comply with. One form of direct lobbying are advocacy meetings. This is where nonprofits are facilitating face time with legislators, and it might be leaders of the nonprofit meeting with these lawmakers, or they may engage volunteers who are personally impacted by that mission. And they want them to engage in that storytelling and to share their stories of strife or how that nonprofit has positively impacted them or how a certain law would positively or negatively impact that person's life. and they're asking that volunteer to meet with that lawmaker to try to influence their opinion and therefore influence the way that they're going to vote on current or future legislation related to that issue. For many years, I led a nonprofit agency associated with diabetes, and I would engage in direct lobbying, including advocacy meetings. I personally do not have diabetes, so I would ask families, usually with children who have diabetes, to join me in these meetings with our lawmakers, because I can tell them all day long about the importance of the cause and my nonprofit and how great it was and the mission. But I don't have that compelling story like my volunteers do who live with this disease day in and day out. So by leveraging my volunteers, having them engage in storytelling to have that emotional draw and that appeal, that's how I really saw the impact being made as these lawmakers, who many of them also had no connection to diabetes, kind of had their eyes opened about how important it is to provide funding for diabetes research to help impact the lives of people who are devastated by this disease. Another form of direct lobbying is public testimony. You see this sometimes on TV when you'll see someone testifying in front of Congress. This is another type of storytelling where people who are impacted by some particular issue or cause will go in front of a legislative body to share their personal stories and to try to influence the vote process and the subsequent laws that are enacted. The purpose of public testimony is to educate lawmakers and influence their decision making. Because if you're not personally impacted sometimes by something, it's hard to see how your vote on a certain issue is going to impact people's lives. So this is really that storytelling, that emotional pull that we discussed in a prior lesson. So direct lobbying is where the nonprofit engages in that direct communication with lawmakers, or they're getting volunteers to come in partnership with them to directly influence legislation. The other type of advocacy is grassroots lobbying, and this is a little bit different. This is where nonprofits try to mobilize their communities to then contact elected officials on their behalf. This can be done through things called calls to action. This is where the nonprofit agency will blow the proverbial whistle and say, it's time to mobilize. There's a piece of legislation that's up for vote. We need to influence our lawmakers. We need everyone who's in support of our mission and our cause and our agency to advocate and to call and to support and to put pressure on these legislators in their local districts and communities to enact meaningful action. So if you're a lawmaker and all of a sudden you get a deluge of emails and phone calls, hundreds or even thousands of people putting pressure on you and sharing their stories and explaining why you should vote in support or against a certain piece of legislation, that's going to influence you. So that's the power of grassroots lobbying. Additionally, nonprofits will sometimes leverage that strength in numbers through coalitions. So as a board member of Cancer Support Community, if there is a piece of legislation that supports government funding for cancer research, for example, I know that CSC is a smaller organization, and that if we mobilize in partnership in a coalition with another agency, especially a huge agency like American Cancer Society and all of the other cancer organizations like Susan G. Komen, LLS, and there are so many cancer organizations, that if we unify and form a coalition and advocate together, we can amplify our impact significantly. When it comes to advocacy campaigns, here are some ways that we rally the troops and get them to push for certain legislative action. One is through calling campaigns. This is where we're contacting legislators by phone in an organized fashion. Usually nonprofits will actually put together talking points and share that with their advocates and say, here's the unified message that we're trying to present. So for example, if we're advocating for government funding for our cause, we want to make sure we all know the statistics, we have the facts, and we're unified and consistent with that as we have potentially dozens or hundreds of people calling lawmakers around the same time period. Online advocacy is a huge thing in nonprofits. This is where you create an online form where supporters and advocates can easily contact their local lawmakers by email or social media, and it's done in an organized fashion. Petitions are where you're putting together a formal appeal to legislators and you're including signatures. So you're designing the petition. In the petition, you're explaining what it is you're advocating for or against. You're putting forth the facts and the data to support that argument. And then you're rallying your supporters and your advocates to sign that petition to show that strength in numbers. Rallies are highly visible. These are public gatherings where you get people to congregate and show up in force around a shared issue that shows that strength in numbers. And then the most hardcore approach, which sometimes is necessary, is litigation. You're actually challenging through a lawsuit and through the legal system certain laws or policies that you're making the argument are unlawful. So most nonprofits have some type of advocacy issue that impacts them. As one example, the Wounded Warrior Project. They're going to advocate for veterans' rights, healthcare, employment, and support services. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They're going to advocate for mental health treatment, insurance equity and parity, and increased awareness over mental health issues and reducing the stigma around mental health therapy, support, and resources. Now, when we engage in advocacy, it's not just about sharing our stories. Storytelling is really important. But to influence lawmakers and decision makers, you have to not just share a story, but you also have to have the facts. Numbers don't lie, and sometimes cold, hard data, research, and statistics can move the needle when it comes to influencing lawmakers toward what you're advocating for. And this is what we call policy research. Policy research is a systematic process where you're studying issues around that legislation. You're gathering the facts, the data. You're trying to build a compelling case for why a lawmaker should support a bill or vote against a bill as your nonprofit determines is the best course of action. With policy research, you're presenting credible arguments and facts. Sometimes policymakers, they only care about, well, how much is this going to cost? Or how many people will be impacted positively if I vote in favor of government funding for this particular issue? So good policy research gives nonprofits credibility as experts in their field. It gives them a logical argument beyond just the emotional appeal of storytelling to make a case in cold, hard data, facts, and figures. As I mentioned previously, nonprofits are often engaged in advocacy work, even if they are a direct service agency. But there are some limitations when it comes to what nonprofits are allowed to do with regard to influencing legislation. Remember from a previous lesson that the majority of nonprofit agencies in the United States are classified as 501c3 organizations. The IRS does have requirements and restrictions for agencies classified as 501c3s, and one of these is in relation to lobbying. The IRS does permit lobbying, but it cannot be a, quote, substantial part of a nonprofit's activities. Now, the difficult thing is the IRS at no point has ever defined what they consider a substantial part. Is it half of an employee's time? Is it a number of people that are employees of the nonprofit working on lobbying efforts or advocacy efforts? There is no clear, defined black and white definition. So there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion here, but most nonprofit agencies do not want to risk their tax-exempt 501c3 status, so they run very conservative when it comes to their engagement in lobbying activities. Further, nonprofits that receive grants in the form of federal funds are not allowed to use that federal funding on lobbying efforts. That's because the government doesn't want to be accused of giving nonprofits money just to have them turn around and use that money to try to get certain political officials or certain political parties elected to office. So there are strict requirements about the use of federal funds in terms of it not being allowed to be used on lobbying. Political campaign activity are those organized efforts and actions to support or oppose political candidates. And when it comes to political campaign activity, that is strictly prohibited for nonprofits. So if I run a nonprofit, I can meet with legislators, try to encourage and persuade them to vote on legislation supporting my mission, but I cannot go out as a nonprofit leader and advocate and stump and rally for a particular political candidate. You're not allowed to do it. It's strictly prohibited. Nonprofits should remain nonpartisan, meaning they are all about all parties. We're not Democratic. We're not Republican. We're not Libertarian. We're not anything. We are nonpartisan. We're impartial, and we are not aligned with any specific political party, any political group, or any politician. So nonprofit leaders have to be really careful when it comes to advocacy work. And it's because of these limitations and restrictions that some nonprofit leaders are hesitant to engage in advocacy efforts as well. Now that you know the importance and the power of nonprofit advocates, let's talk about how nonprofit leaders can go out and mobilize and recruit and deploy these advocates in support of their mission. When we talk about mobilizing, this is very similar to the term of community organizing. And what I mean by this, both of these terms, is that it's all about building those grassroots networks. You're trying to get people in a certain and specific community to unify around a certain cause, to try to impact and affect change that aligns with the organizational mission of the nonprofit. You have to make sure when you're mobilizing advocates that you're explaining to people how their use of their valuable time as an advocate will move the needle. So successful advocacy, it is dependent on strength in numbers. So nonprofit leaders have to have an actual strategy about mobilizing advocates. How are they going to go out and get supporters to advocate on behalf of the cause? When it comes to advocacy mobilization, it's a 5-step process. First, we have to specify the need. If I'm the CEO of NOW, the National Organization of Women, I need to explain to my supporters and to my constituents and my stakeholders the need, for example, for gender equity in pay, as just one example. I then have to present solutions and say, okay, well, one way we can advance pay equity is if we enact some legislation that requires all companies to undergo a required pay audit on an annual basis of all their employees and determine that there is parity in pay equity. Now, that's not actually a thing. I'm making this up as a hypothetical, but this is one example of how a leader could present a solution. As the leader of that organization, we then need to find someone who's in power and who's in politics, who's willing to support a bill like that. We present that as a solution. We rally our people in support around it. Then we go and we share compelling stories. We get the lawmaker who's going to sponsor the bill, and eventually when that bill goes up for a vote, we want anyone who's ever been impacted by a disparity in pay to come forth and tell their compelling stories and to share the negative impact that being discriminated against as a woman has had on their lives. We then need to communicate that message to the broader audience. This is where we're going out and we're doing these public awareness campaigns. We're doing our policy research to show in the United States the persistent and rampant pay disparity between men and women. We're using those cold, hard facts, those data, to communicate that mission, to urge people to support our initiative, and then we identify a clear call to action. So say there's a lawmaker who adopts this as something that they care about, they write a bill, they support that bill, they propose that bill, then we need to mobilize. We put a call to action out for our advocates, all of our supporters that we've already gathered together, and we want them to then come together to try to engage in advocacy efforts, pick up the phone, send emails, send letters, try to encourage all the lawmakers at whatever level this is to try to vote in favor of this bill because it advances our mission towards gender equity. So that's just one hypothetical example of how a nonprofit agency can mobilize advocates. So just like everything else in nonprofit leadership, engaging in strong and effective advocacy, it requires a strategy, it requires a plan, and it requires mobilizing people. But with a strong strategy, a strong supporter base, and a clear direction, nonprofit leaders can leverage advocacy actions to advance their mission.